I would like to welcome you to this webinar, exploring whether we should reduce our intake of meat and dairy. This session is brought to you by the Glasgow Food Policy Partnership and supported by the Glasgow Centre for Population Health Communications team. I am Rita Gonzalez and I coordinate the Glasgow Food Policy Partnership. You may have noticed that yesterday was the Earth Day, which mobilized people around the world to protect the planet. What we eat influences not only our health, but also the health of our planet. And during this webinar, you will hear from expert speakers whether reducing meat and dairy intake might have environmental or health benefits. There will be two presentations followed by a panel Q&A session. I'm now pleased to introduce our first speaker, Professor Lindsay Jaacks. She's a professor of global health and nutrition and director of the Edinburgh Earth Initiative at the University of Edinburgh. She's an epidemiologist interested in understanding how to maximize the nutritional and health co-benefits of sustainability transitions. I will let Professor Jaacks tell you more about her latest work.
Great, thank you so much. So yeah, I'm presenting some work today that was commissioned to the University of Edinburgh by Food Standards Scotland, and I'm really delighted that our collaborators, our colleagues from Food Standards Scotland are here today and will be joining the Q&A session as well as part of this webinar. So just to get started on a bit of background, this work really ultimately arose from a climate change committee recommendation to shift away from all meat and dairy products. This was a 20% shift of both of these by 2030, and then an additional reduction to 35% for meat only by 2050. And the Scottish Government partially accepted these recommendations last year and requested advice from Food Standards Scotland on the implications of this for diet and health. And so this led to the research being commissioned to University of Edinburgh to undertake this sort of assessment of current meat and dairy intakes in Scotland, as well as simulating the impacts of adopting these climate change committee recommendations on nutrient intake, as well as some health outcomes. And I've got some preliminary results for environmental outcomes that I'll be presenting today as well. The data that we use for this report comes from the 2021 Scottish Health Survey, or SHES. This survey had 3,447 adults 16 years and older who completed at least one 24-hour dietary recall, and that served as the sample for this. Actually, 85% of these adults completed 2 dietary recalls. And I'll talk about kind of what the implications of this particular diet assessment method are for the findings. And I'll just note that we are planning to do a very similar analysis for children and young people using data that we're currently collecting from 2 to 15-year-olds living in Scotland. So stay tuned in the future for more results on meat and dairy and the impacts of reducing meat and dairy on nutrient intake in younger people to come soon. So I won't have much time to talk about all the findings, but I see they've put in the chat here a link to the full report. So please do check the full report out, and a really nice brief that was prepared by Food Standards Scotland on the findings. But I'm going to just highlight some of the key points today. Before getting started, I just wanted to point out that the Scottish Health Survey data does have underestimation in terms of the self-reported dietary intake. So here I'm just showing the mean total caloric intake in the sample, which is just over 1,600 calories a day. And we know that this is well below what is required in terms of caloric intake for men and women, which I've highlighted in pink, average requirements for men. And so we know that there's underreporting. It's probably about upwards of a third of energy is underreported. And there are kind of some important implications of this for the findings that I'm going to present today. The first is that we know we're underestimating intake of nutrients, but we don't know by how much, because we don't know what fills that gap between average reported intake and what people are probably actually eating. So we don't know if that is, ultra processed foods that are really nutrient poor, in which case we wouldn't be underestimating intake of micronutrients by that much, or if that gap is really nutrient-rich things, in which case we'd be underestimating substantially more. So this is a gap in the underlying data that unfortunately we weren't able to address. And the implication of that underestimation is that we'll be overestimating the number of people who are at risk of nutrient insufficiency. But just carrying on to some of the key findings, the first is that most people in Scotland consume meat and dairy. So on those up to 2 days of dietary recall, 99% of people reported consuming some dairy in Scotland and 86% consuming some form of meat. So these products are really frequently consumed. And if you look at the type of meat that's reported and the type of dairy that's reported, you can see the spread in these pie charts. So when it comes to meat, and particularly meat that has the highest greenhouse gas emissions intensity, beef makes up about a quarter of meat intake in Scotland. And then when it comes to dairy, cheese, of course, has the highest emissions intensity, and that makes up 14% of dairy. I'll just point out that I'll talk more about the environmental impacts later, but whilst cheese makes up 14% of dairy by weight, it makes up about half of the emissions from dairy, just given how much higher the emissions intensity is for cheese compared to other dairy products. After looking at what level of what types of meat and dairy people are consuming, we looked at the contribution of meat and dairy products to intake of key nutrients. I'm just showing 6 of those here, but we've actually looked at 27 different nutrients overall. And so if there's some favorite nutrient that you have that I haven't shown here, do reach out and we're happy to share that information. But you can see here that there's quite a wide range in terms of the contribution of meat, which is in red, contributing quite a lot to things like zinc and selenium versus dairy, which is more important for things like iodine, calcium, of course, as well as vitamin B12. But you can see that for a lot of these nutrients, you do see a large proportion of the nutrients coming from other products in the diet. And I just wanted to highlight that whilst we use self-reported dietary intake data in this report, the National Diet and Nutrition Survey in a subset of participants does actually assess objective biomarkers of nutrient status. And so in the report, you'll see that there's a section where we summarize those findings. And I thought it was worth highlighting here because we do have some objective blood or urine-based biomarkers, and they give us a bit of a better sense actually of really what the nutritional status is than self-reported diet data, especially when it's so underreported. And you can see here that, of course, many people will be aware that iron deficiency, particularly in women, is a public health concern, but other nutrients that people may not have thought much about, such as iodine, also have a reasonably high proportion of people who have biomarker levels that are below a cut point that suggests deficiency. So what we did now after kind of assessing the baseline status in 2021 in Scotland was think about those climate change committee recommendations. And one of the things that was pointed out that's important to keep in mind is that there's actually already currently guidance on reducing intakes of red processed meat to no more than 70 grams per day. This is a Scottish dietary goal. And what we did is we modeled to see, if everyone in Scotland who's currently above that Scottish dietary goal came down to the goal, what would that achieve in terms of the total, mean meat intake aligned with the Climate Change Committee recommendation? And what we found is that that would give you a 16% reduction, which is actually pretty close to that 20% reduction target, just with that existing FSS guidance. To get down to get that 20% reduction, you'd have to reduce red and red processed meat intake to a maximum of 60 grams per day. And then to achieve a 35% reduction, you'd have to take it much further down. And of course, this would impact even more of the population, bringing it down to 31 grams per day. So quite a low intake of red and red processed meat would be required to get that 35% reduction in total meat. So what we did was we modeled actually all of these in terms of their potential impact on nutrient intake, but just given the length of this presentation, I wanted to focus on this middle one, which is achieving the Climate Change Committee recommendation for a 20% reduction in total meat and also total dairy, but just focusing in terms of hitting that 20% reduction in meat on reducing high consumers of red and red processed meat. So all of the next, the next 3 slides will be focusing on this scenario. And what we found in terms of this is showing the proportion of the population that's below recommended nutrient intake levels for the same 6 nutrients that I showed before. So this is based on, again, the self-reported dietary intake data. It's not the percent who are deficient based on a biomarker, but just based on 1 or 2 days of dietary recall. And so in the blue is the current, so 2021 percentage of the population, and the green is if we achieve the Climate Change Committee recommendations for a 20% reduction in meat by bringing all the high consumers of red and red processed meat down to 60 grams, and then a 20% reduction in dairy across the whole population. And so you can see that, not surprisingly, given the pie charts I showed of the contribution of meat and dairy to nutrient intake, that you do see the slight uptick in the percent of the population who fall below the recommended nutrient intake when you do reduce meat and dairy. And it's really the nutrients that we rely on a lot more for, we rely on meat and dairy a lot more for, that see the biggest increase in that proportion. So calcium, iodine, and zinc in particular saw kind of the larger increases in the percent below recommended nutrient intake when the Climate Change Committee recommendations were achieved. But I think the key thing here is to just note that anyway, at baseline, in blue, the proportions for many of these nutrients are relatively high. So lending, further support to something that we're already aware of, that Scottish diets have a lot of room for improvement in terms of nutritional quality. So we also looked at what would happen if you substituted. So these previous ones were just reducing meat and dairy, but what if, in addition to reducing meat and dairy, going beyond the current Climate Change Committee recommendations, which just do focus on reducing meat and dairy, you substitute in nutrient-rich foods such as beans, vegetables, eggs, oily fish, plant-based meat, or chicken, and plant-based dairy alternatives. What happens then in terms of the proportion below the recommended nutrient intake? And what you can see, particularly on this slide, if you focus on the black bar versus the colorful bars, so the black bar is no substitution, and the colorful ones are substituting in nutrient-rich foods. You can see that you can sort of attenuate that slight uptick as long as you have a targeted substitution of more nutrient-rich foods. We modeled the health impact, and I'm just putting up a couple numbers here, but the model suggests that you will see a reduction in cases of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and BMI if the Climate Change Committee recommendations were achieved, and that's because of the increased risk associated with consumption of red and red processed meat for type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. The reduction in BMI is simply because in this particular model, we modeled it without replacement. So of course, if you're reducing consumption, you'll see a reduction in calories, which translates into a reduction in BMI. So just quickly wanted to comment about environmental impacts. So this is some additional work that we're doing to kind of extend the impacts on nutrition and health to impacts on environment. And for this, we relied on matching the nutrient data bank to FoodDB, which is a data set that contains environmental impact data for more than 60,000 food items available in 8 major retail outlets in the UK. And I won't have time to talk about it, but we used 2 major approaches. The first was fuzzy matching, which is a very traditional form of matching 2 data sets. And then we used AI through the GPT-4 platform, a much more innovative form of matching. And I'm happy to talk more about this if people are interested. And then we used a string search at the end just to get any items that didn't have a match from the fuzzy or GPT-4. This is a picture actually of our team doing the matching that was generated also by GPT-4. But in terms of the impacts, and as I said, these are preliminary, so please don't cite these as they're not final yet. We're aiming to finalize them in the coming weeks. But our preliminary findings suggest that about 38% of consumption-based emissions, food-related emissions in Scotland are coming from meat and meat products, and about 15% from milk and milk products. And then you can kind of see the variability for the other food groups here. Non-alcoholic beverages, I should note, includes coffee and tea. And we haven't disaggregated all of the milk out of the lactase in that category. So there will be some dairy mixed into that brown category as well. And then in terms of the modeling impact of the simulations I mentioned of the Climate Change Committee recommendations, this is just a figure showing compared to the baseline, which is this black line here, how much would emissions be reduced if you followed the Climate Change Committee recommendations without replacement, or if you added in these nutrient-rich replacements. And so this middle one is kind of the scenario that I was focusing on for the nutrient impact. So you can see that that would result in about a 17% reduction in emissions if you saw a 20% reduction in meat and dairy, focusing on bringing the high consumers of red and red processed meat down to 60 grams a day. And that there's only a slight attenuation of that based on the substitute, with a slightly greater attenuation if you substitute with fish and chicken, which have higher emissions intensities than the plant-based products. This actually will be covered in the next presentation, but just wanted to briefly mention for people who are familiar with why we're seeing these results of 38% of emissions coming from meat and meat products. Really, there are two kind of main reasons why eating animal foods results in a higher emission intensity. The first is through indirect emissions, so having to feed animals and the conversion rate of feed into consumable products. So for beef in the UK, it's about 25 kilograms of feed are required to produce a kilogram of beef. And so the kilogram of beef also includes the emissions from 25 kilograms of feed, such as corn or soy, that's produced. And then the other, of course, is direct emissions, and particularly methane, which is a more potent warming in terms of global warming, a more potent greenhouse gas. I just wanted to conclude with just a 30-second conclusion with visuals, actually, because we often get asked, particularly now that we're starting to do this work in children and young people, you know, what should I not be feeding my kid ham sandwiches? And ham sandwiches are one of the most common ways that people in Scotland consume meat. And, you know, instead, should I be feeding my kid a peanut butter sandwich? And my response to that is really actually, you know, well, what kind of bread are you serving it on? And what else is in the diet of your kid? Because it all matters when it comes to thinking about the nutrition and health and well-being of the population. So if you think, you know, this is an example from our current survey of the diet of a 6-year-old child in Scotland. And, you know, you can see it's not just the ham sandwich, which in this case was consumed on ultra-processed refined wheat flour bread, but also, you know, all of the high sugar, high fat, high salt snacks and other items that they're consuming throughout the day for really all their meals and snacks. So if you just swap out that ham sandwich and put a peanut butter sandwich in, that doesn't make this diet magically healthier. All of the parts of the diet and a more holistic approach to improving diets is really required if we're going to move the needle on diets in Scotland. So I'll stop there and leave the acknowledgements up. As I mentioned, Fiona's here today and will be joining for questions. But we have a big team that has contributed a lot throughout this process for all of the different outcomes that we looked at. So many thanks to everyone who contributed. And yeah, thank you for the invitation to speak today.
Thank you so much for that very interesting presentation, Professor Jaacks. Our next speaker is Andrew Stark at Eating Better. 60 organizations working to accelerate the transition from producing and eating too much meat and dairy to a fairer, healthier, and more sustainable food system that is better for animal welfare and for nature. His background is in food, farming, and land use policy. Previously, he worked for RSPP Scotland, where he was coordinator of the Scottish Food Coalition. I'll now hand over to Andrew.
Thanks, Rika, and thanks, Lindsay, for that brilliant presentation as well. And yeah, thanks for the introduction, Rika. Good afternoon, everyone, and good to see, well, I can't see you just yet, but good to see so many people on the call. Well, firstly, thanks very much for the invitation to speak today from the Glasgow Food Policy Partnership. And to Lindsay for the brilliant talk there to talk about this really important subject. And I'm excited to see what questions and discussions come up during the presentation. And it's impossible to cover all aspects of this during this talk, so please do take up my offer to continue the conversation after the presentation. So my name's Andrew Stark. As Rick said, I'm the Senior Research and Policy Manager at Eating Better. So who are Eating Better? So Eating Better is a movement of change of 60 organisations working to accelerate the transition from producing and eating too much meat and dairy to a healthier, fairer and more sustainable food system that is better for animal welfare and for nature. And on the right here, this is just a snapshot of the range of members that we've got, from farmers to food policy groups to environmental charities to health charities. We cover a wide-ranging number of aspects of the food system, and I think that shows the interconnections between the food system and the power of working in collaboration. So I want to set the scene with a few graphs to really set the context about where we are with meat production globally and in the UK and in Scotland as well. So on the left, this is a graph from DEFRA, and this shows the amount of the tonnage of meat production globally. And the thing to take away from this is that poultry has far outstripped all other forms of meat to become the dominator in global meat production. And on the right, this is from a report from the Eating Better Alliance, which shows in OECD countries, again, chicken is the dominant form of meat consumption, around 30 kilograms per person per year. And this is another statistic from DEFRA, which shows milk production in the UK and what that's used for. So milk is the dominant form of the dominant product, but other products such as cheese and cream, and cheese being the second biggest in there as well. So looking at Scotland, this is a map of the UK from one of our members, Compassion in World Farming, an animal welfare charity. And this shows the concentration of mega-style farms and factory farmed animals in the UK. And for Scotland, there's just over 16 million factory farmed animals and 65 mega-style farms in Scotland. And that's defined as the largest factory farms in the UK. So that doesn't take into account sort of smaller intensive farms, but those really large scale ones, that more American-y style of farm that we might have seen in the media. But unfortunately, there's a lack of data to get a regional breakdown of Scotland. But you can sort of see when you look at this map across the UK where the concentrations are of intensive mega-style farms. And you will have seen in the news, hopefully, about the issues around the River Wye on the border between England and Wales as one example. So just putting that map up there to sort of set the context around meat production, and looking at some of the other numbers, there's around 65 billion tons of chicken produced each year across the world, and 850 million reared for UK consumption, and 95% of the UK's broilers chickens are bred in intensive farms. So it is a really big scale problem, and there's lots to be done. So looking at this, I'm not a graphic designer, as you can tell, but I made this map just to illustrate some of the nuances and some of the interconnections around the impacts of intensive meat production. So starting at health, if we think about health in its broadest sense, human, planet, and animal health, Lindsay touched upon some of the health impacts and some of the nutritional aspects of meat consumption. But we can see how intensive meat and intensive consumption of meat can lead to things like unhealthy diets, particularly processed meats, and also poorer animal welfare conditions. And if we link that to the overall ecosystem health of our planet and the nature and climate aspects, which I'll come to discuss now. And with nature, the intensification of food production has unfortunately led to the decline in nature, and we can see that through different indicators such as avian declines, so bird declines, and we can see that from a wildlife loss perspective, 1 in 9 species are at risk of extinction. And building off what Lindsay said there about the climate and emissions towards the end, intensive meat production can lead to the destruction of climate sinks, damaged soil health, and overall higher climate emissions. And power, by this I mean intensive meat is often sits within a much wider global context. So whilst we might look at our food on our plates as something that we got from the supermarket, actually it's linked to a much wider network of power across the global food system. And this is linked to conglomerates, pesticide companies, and fossil fuel companies, and as well as, I guess, solidifying and concentrating power within the food system. That also takes away power from farmers, small-scale farmers, and particularly those who take a loss from supermarkets due to contracts that are unfair. And land use, finally, I wanted to talk about how intensive meat production can lead to a lack of diversity in our landscape and lead to a separation from nature. Deforestation globally to grow livestock feed is a really key issue. So it's not just about the food that we see on our plates in Glasgow and in the UK, but that has environmental impacts beyond our borders. The UK imports, for example, around 3 million tonnes of soya annually, and it's estimated that up to 60% of soya is used by the poultry industry. And meanwhile, when we think about the sorts of land use in Scotland and the sort of crops that we're growing, around 80% of barley is used for livestock feed and goes into malting for whiskey. So I'll come on to some solutions in a minute, but that's just to demonstrate, I guess, how the bit of meat on your plate or in our restaurants and in our cafes has all of these different interconnected issues. So why has this happened? What are some of the drivers of change? So government policy or lack of. I think it's fair to say that food policy across the UK is not overall in a very good place. And whilst there are some positive trends, which I'll come on to discuss, for example, the Good for Nation plan, policy does really need to step up to the plate and drive this change in a positive direction, because business as usual is failing people, farmers, and the planet. Supermarkets and food manufacturers have a really key role to play in shaping the food environment and the places that we experience food, for example, in our supermarkets, and what foods are promoted to us, and driving positive change or negative change within their supply chain. They hold a huge amount of power. For example, Tesco controls around 26% of the market share in the UK alone. Linked to my previous slide, investment companies and consolidation of power. So this is a real global interconnected issue where investment companies are driving some of the openings and some of the development around intensive farms across the UK. And changes in what we've seen a switch, as I sort of mentioned earlier, from beef to chicken for health reasons is one of the drivers. But of course, there are numerous environmental impacts and some health ones as well. Overall, an intensification and specialization of agriculture. So agriculture is focusing more on monoculture, producing one sort of product for one sort of supply in one sort of system. And we've lost a lot of the diversity that creates a more resilient food system. And finally, just to say that a big driver of the change has been those technological changes linked to the intensification. So the efficiency has been the priority at cost of animal welfare, health and planetary health. So looking then to some solutions. So that was all a bit doom and gloom, but there are some really positive trends that show that we can actually do things in a different way, that we can have a food system that is fairer for people, planet, and for farmers. So one of the key things we believe at the Eating Better Alliance is to reduce the overall amount of meat and dairy we are eating, but with higher animal welfare as well. But people should be able to afford better options. I think Lindsay's research and the team there shows how reductions in meat can actually have unintended consequences of worsening health inequalities. So it's really about making sure that people in our food system in Scotland can afford to buy those better meat and dairy options. Using our land holistically, rebalancing what we produce with what we consume, and regulating industrial farming to help transition and afford to those better options, exploring things like the polluter pays principle. And policy has a really key role to play in supporting farmers and crofters, and the market has a key role to play to create a more resilient system with nature and climate friendly farming. So this will go out with the slides and in the notes, but this is a roadmap we produced in collaboration with our Alliance members, which showcased how we can enable change across a range of actions and actors in the food system. And there'll be some for people who work in local authority or in health that are really relevant there at a sort of local government level in terms of getting fruit and vegetables in schools, and those really positive examples of procurement that can be drivers of change across the supply chain. So please do explore that, but we're going to be updating it in the coming months as well to reflect some of the changes, because this was produced in 2019. So there's a few updates to make. So if we think about that graph I had earlier that was in red, I've just flipped it, and we can think how reducing the amount of meat and dairy, but the meat and dairy that we do eat is of a better standard, better for the planet, better for farmers where they're getting a fairer return on their product, and better for the animals within the system. These issues can actually be really positive solutions. So farming can be a positive solution for health, for nature, for climate. We could see a more diverse food system and supply chains which have given power back to farmers. They're getting a fair return for their product, as well as a more diverse landscape and form of land use across Scotland that can make us more resilient to shocks within the food system. And there's not silver bullets within the food system. I think it's really important to focus that there's not one issue that's going to fix all of our problem. But I do think diets and healthy and sustainable diets can be part of that overall picture by looking at these interconnections more clearly. And I've got a nice picture of some happy cows there from Moskill Farm, who some of you may know as a really good example of an ethical dairy system. So we sometimes hear, do people want this? You know, people stop talking to us about food and stop talking to us about the environmental impacts of this, because people just kind of want to get on. And there is an element of truth in that. People are squeezed at the moment due to costs and the recession that we are in. So I think it's really important to not maybe pick it out in the discussion, and I didn't have time to explore it here, but some of the options around affordability of these options. But we've done some polling across the UK, and on the left we can see nearly, well, in both graphs, nearly 2/3 of people are firstly willing to reduce the amount of meat that they eat, and believe that having a sustainable diet will help achieve national food security. So I really think that's important to keep in mind in our advocacy and in our campaigns as those working outside of policy or outside of government, that to reaffirm the message that people do actually want to see change within the food system, and diets can be a part of that. So my summary slide, should we reduce our intake of meat and dairy? Yes, because business as usual is not an option if we want to live in a planet for the future. But we need to be clear about who we is within that question. And as I sort of said there about the unintended consequences of worsening inequalities. Everyone should be able to afford better, and farmers and crofters need support to produce better and transition away from this, some of the harms that they're unintentionally causing. And policy is key. The Scottish Government should lead through the Good Food Nation plan. So the consultation for that closed last night, and hopefully everyone responded and made the point that diets should be a part of the government's plans more clearly, healthy and sustainable diets. and the government should take ownership of that and shape the direction rather than the market or business as usual dictating the trends, which can have unintended consequences for people within the food system. And Glasgow, relating it back to Glasgow Food Policy Partnership, can lead the change on the ground through healthy and sustainable diets, whether that's through procurement, the local food plan, the local policy, and the many brilliant community food initiatives in Glasgow. And just a shout out, we have a campaign called Anything is Possible that's starting next month. And this is celebrating the wonderful world of pulses and beans and some of those alternatives to meat that can really bring to life what this looks like in practice and on your plate. So keep an eye out for that. And please, do follow us on LinkedIn, on our social medias, and in the notes, you'll get the slides for any graphs as well. So just to say thank you, let's keep the conversation going. There's no way I would have covered all the aspects that are related to this topic. And I'm really interested to hear the questions from yourselves, whether this is something that you're struggling with and you're wanting to look at how it relates to the policy areas that the government's developing, or if you're a community food group or a farmer, whatever angle you're coming at, I'd really be interested to speak after the webinar. So I've just put my email up there.
Thank you so much for that thought-provoking presentation, Andrew. I'm now going to invite Professor Jaacks along with Dr. Fiona Comrie to join us for the panel discussion. Fiona Comrie has worked with Professor Jaacks on the recently published research that she just presented. She is a registered public health nutritionist and a senior public health nutrition advisor in nutrition science and policy at Food Standards Scotland. Fiona's areas of expertise are in measuring diets and providing advice to help people make healthier food and drink choices. There are a few questions, and I've noticed that Lindsay, you had actually answered some of them already, and we were actually emailed some questions before this session started. Just a question about the the study from the Food Standards Agency and University of Edinburgh. We heard that some of the nutrients are much more readily available from meat and plant-based sources, and that some people in Scotland are already insufficient in their intakes of some of these nutrients. So if people want to move to a more plant-based diet, would you have any sort of recommendations on meat and dairy-free alternatives that would ensure these that people still are sufficient in their nutrient intakes?
Just to say that if you take a look at the report, we did actually scrape information about the nutrient content of plant-based meat and dairy alternatives available on Scottish supermarkets, and the verdict on that analysis was that it is very variable. So we can't say go for this brand or go for this particular, soy-based milk or almond milk or oat milk, because they're very variable. There isn't one that has all of the things, the calcium and the iodine and the zinc and really all the nutrients that you would want to potentially see to fill some of the gaps that we found in the analysis. So unfortunately, there isn't. And I would say that but I don't work at Food Standards Scotland, so I guess I can say this, but I think like some sort of regulation to just really standardize this in some way, because it can be quite confusing as a consumer. People will look for calcium, but actually there are these other nutrients, like I said, iodine and other things that dairy is a really important source for example. So I think some sort of standardization to make it easier for consumers to know that when they grab an oat-based milk, that it does have the nutrients that they would be missing by not consuming cow's milk would be useful.
That's really super helpful. It can be a bit of a minefield out there, especially for people who don't work in this industry or in this sector. Fiona, do you have something else to add?
Yeah, I agree with Lindsay. Even looking for calcium on some of those milk drinks, more than half of them didn't even have calcium in them, which seems unusual for a milk substitute. So yeah, that does make it really difficult, particularly for dairy, where the substitutes are milk for something, whereas with a meat reduction, you probably spread that across a few more food groups. It might be fish one day, it might be pulses and legumes another day. It might be just cutting it out on one day. And so because you're bringing in different food groups and different foods, you are then able to get the nutrients from a different range of foods. But with dairy, with that one-to-one swap, it is more concerning that people might not be able to choose the absolute best one. Maybe they can't afford it. Maybe it's not available in their local shop. So there are issues around cost and availability. But really, if you are making bigger reductions in your meat and dairy, it's a big planning process. It's not a case of taking out one thing and just immediately switching one thing in and you're fine. Actually, if you're cutting out your ham sandwiches, but also cutting out dairy, what are you going to have if you can't have cheese? And so it requires a different way of thinking about your meals. It requires a different way of planning. And so we're really conscious how difficult that is for most people. As you said, if it's difficult for a nutritionist to do, how easy can it even be for a member of the general public? So we're aware that these dietary changes are not easy to make and they're not easy to get right. So we have a website called Eat Well Your Way, which has some support on it about meal planning, starting from the very beginning with your shopping list right through to being at the shops, then when you're in the kitchen. And so, yeah, that's just all one word, eatwellyourway.scot. And people can go there. There's advice on reducing your meat and dairy that we've recently published on the back of the report. But really, what the meat and dairy work showed, I mean, there's so much detail in there, and I do encourage everyone to go and read it. But actually, what it showed is the diet is poor, and if we can move everybody closer to the Eat Well guide, then we will actually get closer to the health goals and the climate change goals just by doing that. And that's really what Eat Well Your Way is set up to do, help people make the small changes, the small swaps, and gradually build up to a diet that's better for them. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
That's nice, practical advice. We actually had another question coming in as well, about giving your 3 practical steps that a person can take, and 3 reasons that you can give as a practitioner to support someone to reduce their dairy and meat intake. So the question is 3 practical steps to take and 3 reasons for reducing milk and dairy. So maybe we could go around the screen and you could just all give one of your reasons instead of having to think of 3.
Yeah, well, I guess the practical step, I think, I'm stealing this from one of our Alliance members. I saw them speak on a webinar, and I think thinking about food and thinking about the interconnections between what's happening on your plate to your local environment and where that food is coming from is a really important first step. I think it's important, just building on that dairy discussion. I was at a workshop and the icebreaker was what does good milk look like, and everyone spent half an hour going back and forth about whether that's good or whether that's good, because organic and nature-friendly farming versus sort of the dairy-free alternatives. So I think engaging with the food system through that is a really important first step that people can take, and helps it feel less overwhelming, and something that we're never, it's really hard to get perfect day to day, but I think thinking it through is a really good first step.
Lindsay or Fiona, do you want to come in with any practical steps or reasons people might think about reducing milk and dairy?
I can think of plenty of reasons, but not least that if you reduce your red and red processed meat intake, you will reduce your risk of colorectal cancer. And so, starting that now is a really good way to do it. And practical steps, I think, related to what Andrew was saying there, not just thinking about food and the food system, but thinking about your diet over the course of a week or a month, and don't think of it as having to get every day right. And also don't think of it as a punishment. We're not trying to punish you by asking you to eat less meat or less dairy. We're actually asking people to try and eat more of the stuff that is good for them. And so actually the long-term benefits are there, not just in meat reduction, but increasing your fiber, increasing your fruit and vegetables, increasing your whole grains. It's also likely to be cheaper. We know some people have difficulties in how to cook these things and what to do with pulses, but actually a tin of kidney beans is much cheaper than a packet of mince. So if you can think about it in those terms as well, that's probably more than one reason for each, but yeah, that's where I am.
Yeah, that's super. Thank you very much. Affordability is obviously a main driver for a lot of people, and thank you for mentioning beans and pulses. Also, Andrew mentioned there the Everything is Possible, Anything is Possible project. We have our own Full of Beans campaign here in Glasgow, so you can look that up on your time. Lindsay, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, there was a group down at Oxford ran a trial that was called Optimize, and I can't remember what Optimize stands for, but it was called the Optimize trial, and it was very much around trying to get people to reduce their red and red processed meat intake. And what they found was effective was two things in particular. One was self-monitoring, so just even being aware of how much meat you're eating, because I think people are sometimes surprised actually by, that one snack that they had that had meat in it, or they're just kind of surprised until they start sitting down, as Fiona said, and thinking about their intake of meat over the course of a week. And then once you're kind of have done that, just setting small goals of how to reduce it, and then kind of following up on those goals. And they found that that was pretty effective for people. And I think in terms of the small goals, a really straightforward first step would be to just reduce the amount of mince, for example, that's going into things. So if you're making spaghetti bolognese, like doing a third or a half of the mince, swapping that out for lentils or for meat alternatives, other meat alternatives, or adding in more vegetables, more tomatoes. So, just trying to kind of not necessarily change what you're eating, the spaghetti bolognese, but just changing the amount of meat that goes into it can actually have a huge impact. And when we think about the amount of meat that needs to be reduced in a typical person in Scotland to hit that 20%, that 35%, it's not a huge amount in a given day, so I think these sorts of small tweaks can go a long way actually in terms of the overall population's consumption.
That's very helpful. There's another question here. I don't know if any of you would have this answer, but what is roughly the difference between the average Scottish and the UK diet? Is it generally possible to use the UK data as a proxy for Scottish diets? I don't know if our panelists have the details. Lindsay, you are nodding.
Yeah, we do. And unfortunately, I can't share the link because I don't think this has been published yet, but it will be hopefully soon. We have done some side-by-side comparisons of the Scottish Health Survey and the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, the latest data for the two, and in adults, because we don't yet have the kids' data. And the results of that show that they're pretty similar. There could be some higher, for example, dairy consumption in Scotland, but it's not like we're talking about 20% of calories coming from dairy in Scotland and 5 in the rest of the UK. It's a minor difference of a couple percentages. So, roughly speaking, in terms of the food groups contributing to intake, they're pretty comparable. Yeah. But Fiona, did you want to come in and say?
Yeah, I also, just to add to that, we now use Intake 24 in the Scottish Health Survey, and so we have data from 2018, data from 21, which is on the UK Data Archive, so is available to anyone who wants to use it. And Intake 24 is running again this year, 2024, in the Scottish Health Survey, and again, it will be next year till it's available, but it will be archived. And so if you're looking for Scottish data, it is there. And with regards to the NDNS, their latest report should be out this year as well. And again, that data would be archived too. So yeah, that's quite new for Scotland that the data is available. But yeah, it's there, and we're happy for anyone to use it.
That definitely.
And the children's survey data will be archived too. Sorry, once we've got the report out. So yeah, that will be going up as well.
That's great. We'll look out for that report. Thank you. There is a question here for you, Andrew, about going from high intensive livestock systems to less to better livestock system, and what will be the future for more futuristic proteins grown in the lab, for example? Do these kind of protein sources fit into the Eating Better Alliance's vision at all?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Mads. And I think it's a really important one to consider. Yes, they do fit into our overall vision. I would say that there are some really positive trends in alternative proteins, and we have members such as the Good Food Institute and others across the Alliance who are looking at how these alternative proteins fit into our food system, for whether that's saving money on costs, taking up less land use, lower inputs from an environmental perspective. But the caveat I would say is, when I mentioned technological fixes, is to not focus on these magic silver bullets that are going to fix the problem. And there are some really positive aspects to livestock farming in Scotland, which we should retain, whether that's cattle grazing on the Western Isles, which is so important for biodiversity, and that cannot be done by lab tech grown meat. So it's really important that we get that balance right between the really useful trends for replacing some of those nutrient deficiencies in the switch, as Lindsay and Fiona have spoken about, or other beneficial reasons. So yes, but with caveats, and particularly when it comes to power, and whether these are trends that are reinforcing power from those large conglomerates switching their investments to alternative proteins, or whether it's a genuine sort of vehicle for change. So I guess in sum, that's why the government policy is really important, to give this a guide and to give these trends some structure. Otherwise, we do risk that sort of business as usual approach reinventing itself to continue making profit at the expense of people and planet.
Thank you for that very detailed answer, Andrew. We have time for one last question. It's to do with the hospitality sector and what role they could play in supporting and educating customers on reducing their meat and dairy choices and intake. Do you have any kind of anything you would like to say about that? I see you nodding again, Lindsay, so go ahead.
I was nodding, but looking at Fiona, because FSS is doing a lot of work with the out-of-home sector. So I was actually nodding, thinking Fiona might have some thoughts on this.
Yes, sorry, I was typing an answer to another question because I didn't realize that we could see those questions because we can see two different chats. Anyway, yes, FSS does do a lot of work with the out-of-home sector, and we've recently put out something called Eating Out, Eating Well, which is a framework for out-of-home businesses, and it doesn't go into a great level of detail, to be fair, about meat and dairy. It's probably fair enough to say that there are some tensions that exist between the livestock agenda and, say, a reduction agenda in Scotland. So, but yes, pointing consumers towards different options and the same things that can be done at home, using less meat in recipes, and just sorry, what am I trying to say here? And making sure there are different offers available. I mean, to be honest, we'd be really happy to have this kind of conversation. The out-of-home work is not my speciality, but, and was it Rebecca, was it, who asked that question? So if you did want to talk to FSS, then I'll put my email address in the chat and I can pass you on to the right person, because we've got loads of people in the team who would be really happy to talk about taking this forward. So yeah, I'll just drop my email address just now, and yeah, there are people better qualified in FSS than me to talk about that.
That's really helpful. It's great you're making connections during this webinar as well. Unfortunately, we are running out of time now, and we didn't have time to answer all of your questions. So what we can do is we can look through those questions and send them to our speakers and panelists, and if they want to answer, we can actually distribute the answers as part of our post-event feedback or email. So huge thank you to all of you for your amazing questions, and to our amazing speakers for this thought-provoking session. The webinar was recorded and will be made available after this event. It was part of the Glasgow Food Policy Partnership's webinar series. We have 2 more webinars coming up before the summer, and those will be publicized very soon. We would really welcome your feedback on this session so that we can, that will help us plan our next webinar. So there's an evaluation form that will be part of your post-event email as well. Finally, special thank you to the Glasgow Centre for Population Health Communications team helping us put on this event today. So thank you very much for coming along and hope you will enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.